Hi, everyone. I'm Alaka, a healthcare researcher and data scientist, and I'm really excited to talk to John Burn-Murdoch today. He's the chief data reporter at the Financial Times, and he's behind much of their rigorous and compelling data journalism on the social trends that shape public debate and policy, including demographics and fertility. And I really enjoyed his recent work on how birth rates and relationships are declining globally, the drivers and red herrings, and why we should care. And we're going to use this topic to also anchor a more broad discussion around how to tell data stories responsibly, effectively, in an empowering way in this age of social media. So, John, welcome again. Really excited to talk to you.
Yeah, awesome. Great to be here.
Cool. So let's talk about fertility. It's falling everywhere, as you've reported in your work, across rich and poor countries, different political systems, different cultures. And of course, this has huge implications for global welfare and what we do about it. And while the data can be messy, explanations thus become ever more important to get people to care about this and to do something about it. And two of your pieces come to mind in this regard. You've written about the relationship recession, which challenges some standard narratives around what is causing this. So people often think that it's because couples are having fewer children because they're too busy working or living their best lives or whatever. And you've pointed out that it's actually probably because couples aren't forming across all segments of society. And that you've also pointed out that at least in developed countries, much of the fall in birth rates is actually driven by progressives having fewer children. So I wanted to learn a bit more about how you arrived at these narratives and felt confident enough to share them.
Cool. Yeah. I was actually just looking, I'm just looking something up while I answer this one because I suddenly remembered where I actually first wrote down the words relationship recession or birth rate recession or something. And that was an event I went to, like a roundtable event, early 2024, where there's a demographer from Finland called Anna Rotkirch, who some of you might be familiar with. And she was talking about the situation from the Finnish perspective. And fairly early on, she made this point that um, what they were seeing was a not so much a birth rate crisis as a partnership crisis. And she had this amazing stat that in Finland it was now more common for people who form relationships. Or sorry, it's more common once a couple moves in together. It's now more common for them to separate than to have a kid. Um, and that struck me as this just really eye-opening. Um, and so I jotted down that note then, and then in my line of work, it's then a question of thinking, right, like I would ideally want to talk about something that's broader than just one country. So I now want to find as much data as I can that speaks to this issue from elsewhere. So that was part of it. There was also the fact that being a weird data nerd, I just spend lots of time poking around in various data sets, including one called the Human Fertility Database, which collates super detailed data on births and fertility and that kind of thing in a couple of dozen countries, going back well over 100 years in some cases. And every now and again, I just look at that and I'd noticed something else recently, which was that the most common number of children for people to have by their late 30s had flipped quite quickly in recent years from two to zero. So again, this idea that we're not so much seeing the previous story of smaller families, but we're seeing a new story of no families. So yeah, it's the combination of my ears prick up whenever I hear someone say something that sounds like it could be this big sort of striking trend. Then I try and keep my eyes on all these data sets, and then I'm also just trying to chat to as many people as possible who work on things I'm interested in as well. So someone like Alice Evans, who I'm sure some of you again will be familiar with, has done a lot of work and a lot of theorizing on this space. So she and I chat regularly, and this is something she's done a lot of work in as well. There's a American demographer, Lyman Stone, who's also done a lot of interesting quantitative analysis on again exactly this question. And one of the things that Lyman did, which again led me to feel really confident in this idea, was he had done this analysis of decomposing the fall in birth rates in the US into how much of it was due to stable couples having fewer kids and how much was due to fewer couples. And again, he'd found that it used to be stable couples having fewer kids, and then it had recently shifted to be more about fewer couples. So yeah, it's all those things really. The sweet spot for me is when I know that experts in the domain think something is legit. I know that three or four or five different countries I've looked at in the data all show signs of it. And yeah, then it all really comes together.
So as you were looking at that data for yourself, um, do you start by trying to replicate what other people have done, or do you take your own angle to it, and see if you're able to arrive at the same answers?
Yeah, I find weird thing for my job is my specialism is like data and charts, as in rather than a subject matter domain. I'm not like a demographic expert. I'm not a economic expert. I know enough to interrogate all of these topics, but that's why I think my starting point usually when I'm working with an unfamiliar data set or unfamiliar topic is to try and replicate something that's out there. And that's my way of being like, okay, right, I've got it, I've got how this works, and I can now extend that either applying something to a different country or a different time period and that kind of thing. So, I mean, to be fair with birth rates and demography, I've been working with this data for several years now, and I do regularly check in with friendly demographers, as it were, to make sure I'm doing things the right way. But yeah, on this one, like replicating Lyman's work, for example, and extending that forward was a key part of this. And yeah, so it's I'm trying to think like so. For example, this week I'm looking at tax rates and tax policies in a few countries around the world. So this would be a similar case where I've come to a topic which I know a decent amount about, but I'm not an expert. So I poked around in various bits of data, cross-checking some of the analysis I'm doing with stuff that's out there to make sure everything looks about right, and simultaneously reaching out to a couple of tax experts and saying, in this case, what I did was I just said, right, I'm writing this piece. I've looked at some data, and here's like a bullet point version of what I think the story is. And then I asked them to sort of call me and tell me if I'm wrong. That for me feels like a decent way of doing it because like obviously I would say like the conventional approach in journalism is you start with zero and you go to someone and say, what do you think? Just tell me what's happening. And what I try to do in data journalism is start with more than zero and ask someone, does this look right to you? Because obviously, the first version of those is great as well, but you almost by definition, you're not often going to come up with something original because if you're just saying to someone, what do you already know about this? Then you get incremental news and that kind of thing. But for me, the sweet spot is right. I've tried to get up to speed on this topic. Now, here's something that I think is underappreciated or new, but I don't want to get this wrong. So I'm going to take my thing that I think is underappreciated and new and check it with people who know what they're talking about. So yeah, that is, I would say, yeah, how I approached it with the birth rate stuff and how I'm approaching it with taxes this week.
Yeah. And I mean, I was listening to your conversation with Alice Evans on this. One thing that felt underappreciated and new to me is that this decline is not just global, but it's happening across the parts of the social spectrum that people don't think about, like socially disadvantaged people are, and also in poorer countries, people are forming fewer relationships and having fewer children. And I don't think this is talked about. And yet this is a huge problem because that means people are not able to form partnerships and find social support, and something in the social fabric is breaking. And you write about a lot of these sensitive topics in a very compelling and empathetic way. How do you how, tell me more about like your approach to that, given that you are trying to have very sensitive and important conversations, but also back it up with data? How do you do that?
Yeah, so but it's funny, like I feel like so much of my job or of a lot of journalist jobs or a lot of people's jobs, period, is communications, is comms. So especially in the social media age, I kind of approach everything I'm working on, including every chart, by starting by thinking, how could someone get the wrong end of the stick with this? Like, how could someone be confused by this, or how could they feel like this was in some way triggering them, that kind of thing, or provoking them? And for a lot of like charts of GDP per capita or something, that's not really a live issue. But there are some things where I think, right, if someone thinks I'm overemphasizing something, or if the wording of my chart title is too strong, could that just massively derail the entire conversation? So, like, to give you one example of when this did happen in a way that really surprised me, a couple of years ago, I did a piece about looking at the possible role of smartphones in worsening young adult mental health. Um, and I had this chart where there were two lines on it. One was the share of US teenagers who say they regularly meet up with friends, and the other was the share of people who say it just feels pretty crap to be existing in the modern world. And the two things were like inversely correlated. So the less people were hanging out with friends, the more they felt pretty down. Um, and what I had done was I'd added some shading in the background from 2010 onwards, saying this was the smartphone era. So I'm saying, right, we've got these two things which are correlated, and then I'm just adding context by saying the the period where people started hanging out less and people started feeling worse coincides with when smartphones were around. Now, this is obviously quite a heated debate, especially in the academic world. There are a lot of people, very, very careful, rigorous, smart people working in this space who are still struggling to find strong causal evidence that smartphones are doing this. And so what happened was a couple of super smart, rigorous people said they just really kicked off and said, like, this bit of your chart that says smartphones, that's implying causation, um, and it became like a whole sort of side debate, in a way that, yeah, I hadn't expected at all. And so I spent like a couple of days just sort of firefighting these conversations around accusations of sort of alarmist chart making and that kind of thing. I think there was one was sort of saying, "Oh, right, are we just sort of putting lines on charts with labels of things that were happening at the time now?" And there were some funny meme type things that came out of it. And absolutely no shade on any of the people who were calling that out, because I think it really, for me, underscored how powerful charts can be in terms of provoking a response, whether that is a response of like, wow, this is interesting, or whether that's a response of like, whoa, 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 what are you trying to say here? So it definitely has made me a lot more careful in terms of what text I put on charts now. So yeah, that's just an example, I think, of like how this stuff can sort of fire people up. And so yeah, whether I'm writing a chart title or writing a paragraph in an article, I'm always thinking, uh, is there a risk that the important point I'm trying to make here gets derailed by someone just picking up on some little wording thing?
Yeah, I think in one of your talks you mentioned that of all the things that people remember about a chart, the title and the words are really important because, of course, the graphs are important too because they provide more context. They provide a sense of the shape of how a trend is unfolding, but people remember the title, and that's really important. And to your point about the fact that conversations about causality come up with topics like this, about with topics like fertility, it's because people are trying to understand what exactly is causing this. And it's very hard to depict that in a set of graphs. Like I think a set of charts can tell you like this is what is happening across the world, but then you have to like go a step deeper to understand what's going on. And I think you try to do some of that by like decomposing a chart progressively or showing how you built it up or by allowing people to interact with the data. So I've
Yeah,
always found that really cool.
yeah, cool.
I also want to invite questions as we have this conversation. So if anyone wants to chime in with any questions or comments, please raise your hand or post in the chat. I've got an endless list of questions as well that I can continue going through.
Yeah, great.
So yeah, if anyone wants to chime in, please do. Um, I'll keep that invitation open, but I did want to keep talking about some of your work on fertility. You've obviously pointed to like you in your pieces you talk about things that don't work for boosting fertility, things like certain pro-family policies that might not work. You've also ruled out some like common explanations for why that don't seem to hold up as well. And I'm curious, given that the data is often messy and it's hard to come up with clear causal or conclusive takeaways here, how do you balance that against the fact that it is important to get people talking about these things in a clear way that they can understand? And what's your approach to communicating that?
Yeah, this is a massive challenge to be honest. And again, I would say there are examples here where it has not been completely successful. So you mentioned one of my pieces there where I think it was something like why family friendly policies don't boost birth rates. And that was one where so Lyman Stone, who I've mentioned earlier as US demographer who does really interesting work on this stuff. He actually reacted quite badly to that piece because his position was, well, we have all of these very careful studies showing that family friendly policies do boost birth rates. And essentially, this all came down to a miscommunication in that um, I was saying, if you imagine just birth rates trend over time, all these countries are trying all these policies and birth rates are still trending downwards. So in that sense, these policies are not boosting birth rates. Whereas Lyman was correctly pointing out that relative to the counterfactual where these policies don't exist, this trend is probably at a higher level than it would otherwise be. Um, so that was just an example of how like the title, even though Lyman didn't like, there was not really any much disagreement with the content of the article, but this framing can completely throw off the entire thing. Um, so yeah, that it just again underscores how wording, phrasing, caveats, all of these things are so important. So as you say on a topic like this, which is so multifaceted, and where anyone who tells you it's just this and it's nothing else, or it's definitely not that, is almost certainly incorrect. The challenge I have is that I have 700 words in each of my columns. And you can either with that amount with that word count, you can either say sort of three things quite concisely but clearly, or as soon as you try to say a fourth thing, you get into danger of, well, almost by definition, something's going to be oversimplified, or something's going to be said in a way that allows someone to misinterpret it. Or there's the other danger is that if an article looks as if it's trying to be completely comprehensive, then I get emails saying like, but you didn't mention this, you didn't mention this, you didn't mention this, and I'm like, sure, but I couldn't. But but the point is that is on me. Like if I give someone the impression that I'm trying to do a definitive take and then it's not definitive, that's on me. So yeah, that is a recurring challenge for me is if most things that are worth saying require more than 700 words to do it properly. So it's this question of when do I sometimes need to split something into multiple articles, or if I'm going to try and say a lot in one, then just make sure it's caveated accordingly. Like and I often will just as a for me, I feel it's a sort of signal of nuance. If I just insert a sentence somewhere saying, of course these things are complex and multifaceted, but, and then I will focus on like one potential factor. But again, I've had several times when people have come back to me on pieces like this and said, oh, you only talked about this one thing and it implies that you think it's all this. And I say, well, I did literally write it's not only one thing. But if you write it's not one thing and then write 200 words about one thing, you give that impression. So yeah, like I say, it's sort of I spend hours and hours crunching data, but then 90% of the response comes down to what word did I use in what place.
Yeah, I mean it's funny you say that, and at the same time, writing about one or two things can make the narrative so much more compelling and clear. Like in your piece about why progressives should care about falling birth rates, I mean, you focus on climate change, which has been one of the things that people talk widely about. Well, if there are fewer people, then it's less stress on the climate, and I think you break that down into why that is not necessarily the case, why more innovation is a good thing and can help solve this problem. And Spears and Giroux also talk about that, like some of the innovation that has happened in the world is because of people, and
Yeah,
more people are a good thing. So I think by like just focusing on that one thing that has been such a dominant um, point that people have made as to why maybe we should have fewer people. I think you make a clearer case, and then you go further into like, okay, that's one part of the story. Here's the other part of the story, which is you talk about how it can also lead to like change. I mean, how families form, how that affects fertility can also change what kind of policies get passed down in the future. So I thought that was a good example of like being laser focused, but still
nice. Yeah,
opening.
that's again, funnily, that was one where one of my editors, I think, thought I should only have talked about one of those two things. But for me, I was like, he wasn't wrong. But for me, it's the whole framing of like we know that progressives have been uncomfortable talking about the need to boost fertility rates. And so for me, trying to not completely comprehensively, but trying to come at that question in a couple of ways. So it does feel more substantial rather than just saying like, here's why climate change. But yeah, rather than just focusing on one of those. So yeah, constant balance.
Yeah. Inez, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, you ha had a question.
Yeah, you can ask in person if you want. I can see it in
Okay,
the
I
chat,
didn't
but
realize, sorry.
yeah.
So I
Cool.
wrote in the chat, what realistic slash implementable technologies to influence culture and attitudes, both
Mhm.
towards singledom and children, can you foresee?
Super interesting question. The the funny thing about culture is often the cultural changes are pretty much unforeseeable. But that's a very tedious answer. So I'm super curious at the moment to see what happens with people spending more time talking to large language models, to generative AI. Like I, my current take on this, as it were, is that I think if people spend less time on social media but more time talking to ChatGPT, I think that's actually going to be good for people. I know the raised eyebrows there, so I'll like, explain that a little bit. I essentially, it comes down to two things for me. One is that I just think social media has not again, not all social media, but a lot of social media has become such a toxic place in terms of constant negativity, things being overhyped, a very unrepresentative view of what's going on in the world. So I think if people just consume less of that, that's good. The other side of it is it's completely passive for most people on social media. You're just scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. Whereas at least talking to ChatGPT is an active thing. You are deciding to do something, deciding to ask something, deciding to have a conversation, which is kind of like the internet was 15 years ago. So just in those two sort of mechanistic ways, I think that it could be really interesting to see what impact that has on culture. Um, but there are obvious ways as well in which I think everyone spending more time talking to AI could be bad for culture, especially on the point of relationships and singledom. Um, I think there's already tentative evidence that some people are having sort of relationship related chats with AI. Maybe talking about like my boyfriend or girlfriend just did such and such. How should I think about that? Like that sort of thing. And to be fair, again, I think that apps like ChatGPT come in for a lot of criticism, but I suspect the average sort of relationships and mental health chat that someone has with AI is probably beneficial. But yeah, super interesting. Like, are we going to end up with a world where everyone just talks to their own little ChatGPT persona and no one hangs out or has relationships anymore? That would be bad. Or will just the reduction in consumption of toxic social media maybe just make everyone realize they have more in common with one another. So yeah, that's just one narrow way in which in which culture could change due to technological stuff happening at the moment. But other times it's almost if something that's come up a lot in this fertility debate is what happens when like a super famous celebrity, millennial Gen Z celebrity, like starts having kids, and will everyone will suddenly be like, oh right, that seems to be a cool thing, like make a demonstration that people can be super cool and independent and admirable and parents. So there's the theory there. Someone I was once at an event talking about this kind of stuff where someone theorized like if I think the question was if you were a government that wanted to boost birth rates in a non-bad way, what would you do? And someone said, well, just pay Taylor Swift loads of money to like get married and have kids. So yeah, I think there are so many interesting ways that this would go, but yeah, for me, the fact that the current trend does seem to be mainly about fewer people being in committed relationships, it means that like I think the most likely way to cause the most likely thing that would cause birth rates to rise or at least to stabilize would be something that affects that part of the equation.
Thank you.
Cool.
So that brings me to this other question I have, which is what is the role of a data journalist? So you're communicating what you believe to be true, why we should care. And then there's this piece around advocacy that can also seep in where you have an idea about what should be done about it. How do you tread that line and how do you think about your role in that?
Yeah, again, I kind of think my word limits help me here because I usually only have time to either describe something that I think is happening or say what should be done about it. And I find the describe if I think there's something that people don't know about, then I find that much more interesting. So again, I have had people say to me, they're like, "Oh, I really enjoy reading your stuff, but you always finish before saying what should be done." Um, and Sorry, and on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, that is a frustration, but also it's sometimes I'm like, I don't know. At the moment, I kind of think there are really super smart policy experts who have great ideas on what should be done about things. And I see my role as occasionally signposting to their work. I honestly, yeah, I think it's just that in terms of the amount of time and resource I have to do stuff, the figuring out bit takes about as much time as I have, and I often just don't get into the what should be done part. I've talked before about how like if I changed my cadence so that I wrote one thing every 2 weeks instead of every week, I could have like the second week could be okay, now that I've shown what's happening, what should we do about it? So yeah, that's my kind of weird answer to that one. Like I'm sure I have views about what should be done about some things, but I think this is where I just the more I look at these things and I look at the data and I talk to different people, the more I realize how complex a lot of these things are, and that some proposed remedies or just proposed policies for certain areas are they'd probably be beneficial, but it's not clear that they would solve the problem. And I guess I feel like, again, with my space constraints, if I were to write, here's what I think should be done about something, and that was only one of like three possible solutions, and some of the others were more effective, that's where I would feel particularly uneasy about having advocated for something that might not be the best idea. Whereas if I'm just describing things happening in the world, that feels a mission feels like less of a sin. Yeah, so it's it is especially at a place like the Financial Times. I feel like we should be coming up with policies that can solve problems. So I do that occasionally, and a lot of my colleagues do that a lot more regularly. Um, but yeah, it's a super interesting question. I hadn't thought hugely about that one before.
Um, Another thing that, I mean, speaking of your Financial Times pieces that I wanted to talk about is the charts, because I think they are a great way of communicating a lot of complex information. And that's how I came across your work in the very beginning on Twitter. Like, I think your threads and charts are widely shared and encourage a lot of debate. And how do you go about pairing a piece with a chart? Like, how do you decide that this is the right way to visually tell this story and what goes into that? And feel free to pick a piece that you recently worked on where you were had an interesting experience with coming up with a chart and break that down for us.
Yeah, I mean, there was actually a recent one on I'll see. Am I allowed to share my screen?
Yeah, you should be able to. And
Yeah,
if you can't, I can
great. I
give you
will
permissions.
I will do that. Yeah, so the interesting thing for me is that despite the fact that I've been making charts, so this was a piece I did recently about pensioners' incomes relative to working age people in different countries. And among other things, I had this chart about how recently in France, the average income of pensioners was higher than the average income for working age people. And this chart ended up really taking a life of its own. Like it got shared massively on social media and reused in some other articles. But the funny thing about that is like I wasn't even sure when I started working on this piece if I would make this chart or what it would look like or whether I would do it as like a time series or just as bars or dots or something. So despite the fact that I've been making like a dozen charts a week for several years, sometimes I still don't fully know which ones are the ones that are going to really sort of capture the imagination and stuff. So I'll just come back to the room as it were. But generally, yeah, I generally try to have what I think is going to be a very striking shareable chart for each piece that I work on. Now, obviously, some are more striking and shareable than others. But for me, I kind of see it as my job to like the thing that in theory, sets me apart from other great writers at the Financial Times is I'm going to have data and charts. And so if I'm working on a piece that doesn't have an interesting chart in it, then even if the rest of that piece is great, I will sort of feel like I've not quite done my job. Now, I don't think I should think about it in that way. And I suspect if my editor heard me saying that, she'd say, "What? You're crazy." Because of course, I'm writing articles where people read the words. And I definitely do think I get too hung up on that. But that's just my general approach is I think, right, if I'm going to put a lot of time and effort into something, I want this to be something that people see and feel resonates with them and want to share. So yeah, that's sort of my general approach. And I see we've got a question, but just before I come on to that, I would say the yeah, it's my process, I guess, is I'm always trying to distill what's the central thing that this piece is saying. So whether it is France and Britain are in for all to pensioners, whether it's why progressive needs to care about birth rates, I'm trying to distill that question down. And for me, that part of that process is, and what is the chart that will tell people that? Um, so yeah, that's sort of my starting point. And should we take this question and then maybe say more on that?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, I think my question is probably quite linked to what you were just talking about. So I just sort of want to understand a bit more about the process from the start of writing the article. Is it a case of once you've got the data set, once you've got the question that you're going to work on, you've got an idea of what those charts are then going to look like? It's like if this is the insight we're going to be showing, this is what the chart's going to look like. Is it that sort of process?
Yeah, so I would say I almost always start with like a hunch for what I think things this interesting thing might be. And then I go and look at the data to see if that stands up. And like the invisible thing is that I don't know, maybe 50% of my hunches just don't turn out to be that way. And so I'll sometimes spend a day digging into something and then be like, not a thing. But yeah, that's generally the way it goes. So I've been asked before, like, do you start with data or a question? And I would say almost always start with a question, because starting with data is a great way to waste your time on something that doesn't tell you anything interesting. But yeah, so it's typically right. I've got a vague sense that there's something interesting. And then question one is, what data would I need to use to determine whether this is true? Then I do the analysis. In the process of doing that analysis, I'll make some rough charts as I'm going along. And at some point I'll think, oh yeah, this is a good one. Because I've been doing it for so long, sometimes I can almost predict what that chart is going to be before I've even looked at the data, or if I've done enough reading around the topic that I'll have a good sense of it. But there have been other times, like that French one, where I only really discover as I'm going through. I'm like, oh, that's a really striking way of showing something. But yeah, it's basically hunch/question, then go find the data, and then yeah, find the most compelling way of showing it. And I'd say actually, like, that's one of the things where I'm finding AI useful at the moment, is in that step two of what do I need to, like, answer this hunch. So I'm trying to think of any other recent example where, like, a common question that I will now ask, like, ChatGPT or Claude, is like, if I wanted to determine whether, like, I don't know, young people are paying, or no, I'll think of it, a real one. A recent one was like, if I wanted to know whether there has been a rise in risky online behaviors among young people, like gambling, crypto, that kind of thing. And if I wanted to map that onto something like politics, like political attitudes, what survey data would I need to use? So I'm just trying to, like, use AI to speed up that process of what are the raw materials I need to answer this question. And I guess the other side of that coin is trying to, the way I think about it is, I need to find out as quickly as possible every week whether my idea is nonsense. So again, AI can help with that, in terms of, I will say, had this hunch, can you just tell me if this is bollocks? Because, like, I still, that's the way I usually do it. I don't say tell me if it's true, because I want to actually try and figure it out if it is. But I do at least want to be told, right, John, stop wasting your time. This is not a thing. So yeah, that's basically the process and how it's changed in the last year or so.
Yeah, cool. I think, like, you probably answered the other main question that's sort of in my head around whether you start with data or whether you start with a question as well. So, in terms of, like, the use of the data, I guess you always have a bit of an idea of generally where you need to go to collect that data, though, rather than just scrambling around somewhere to try and find anything.
Pretty much, yeah. Like, if I don't have a clue where to look, then that's where I just immediately start thinking, this is a great way to waste 2 days. But it's rare that I would have no idea, because these are the times when I just ping someone an email. It's like the privilege of being, like, at the Financial Times, is I can send someone an email, and most times they'll see that and think, oh right, I should get back to this person. And again, sometimes I might email someone and they still say they don't know. And there are things such as, like, data on like online gambling, survey data on that is, like, there's very, very little. So sometimes I just draw a blank, and then I sometimes get a bit frustrated when someone else writes about a topic and I think, oh, I would have written that, but there wasn't any data, and maybe I should just write about stuff without data sometimes. But yeah, that's basically the process. So several years in, I now just know loads and loads and loads of data sets. But I'm always encountering new stuff, and, like, whenever I see someone else doing a cool bit of work, as a weird nerd, I just scroll straight to the bottom and see, like, what data did they use to find that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Nice. Thanks.
John, you mentioned a little while ago that being able to pair your stories with charts is very important to you. Has there ever been a case where you felt like you had a great story and you were confident in the finding, but you couldn't figure out how to pair it with a chart? Did that stop you in any way, or how did you adjust?
That's a very good question. there have definitely been times when I'm like, look, none of these charts are particularly striking in this piece, and I just again, those are times when I remember that actually that's fine. Um, and I'll just put something out with like a bar chart in it. And again, sometimes people go, wow, this bar chart is amazing. And I'll think, ah, right, people like those too. But yeah, generally I there were times in the past when I kind of wanted every article to have like three amazing charts in it, and that was kind of ridiculous. And now I'm more forgiving with myself in terms of if the piece of work is a good piece of work, then the chart doesn't have to be super fancy. And as I say, paradoxically, sometimes those are the ones where the actual argument I was trying to make almost comes to the fore more. So yeah, I think if I can have all the nice things, then that's great. But it's fine to not.
Uh-huh. And you're active on a lot of different mediums. Like you've got your long form pieces in the Financial Times. You have a lot of great Twitter threads or X threads. You're also on podcasts discussing many of these same topics. So I'm curious about your experience on each of these mediums. What stories are best on each of these platforms? How do you use them? And what gets lost?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I've talked a couple of times about how like my word count at the FT can be a bit of a constraint. I'd say, funnily enough, I probably used to write more in some of my Twitter threads than in the published articles, um, because the threads would be give the space to go into the caveats and to think about again how to frame something for a like mass public audience versus for a like FT audience. So yeah, sometimes I would do like several hours more work just for things in a thread, and then I had a kid and I don't do that anymore. But yeah, so that's one interesting thing, and just doing threads, I find um you just end up going down all these different avenues because of the things inevitably get shaped by the audience that interact with things. So I think sometimes posting on social media is as much about the discussion and ideas and stuff that come off the back of that as it is about just getting something out there. Um, like for me, the ideas are basically the currency. Like if I run out of ideas, then I'm in trouble. And I sometimes go back and forth with myself where I think if I spend 45 minutes on social media posting a thread or something, is that a bad use of my time that I could be working, or is it a good use of my time because someone will reply to that with something really interesting that will then spark another idea? So yeah, I think social media has been amazing for this kind of thing. Like I don't know if I would ever have ended up in this line of work or in the specific thing I'm doing at the moment if posting things into the world hadn't been possible. Like it's that constant feedback, the way to both figure out what people are interested in and to quickly learn what works and what doesn't. I think for me has been like an absolutely critical part of how my work has evolved. Um, and then separately, yeah, podcasts are really interesting. Obviously, they're for charts and visuals. They're not the perfect platform. You know, these days with more video podcasts, maybe I should think about doing more of that sort of thing. Um, but what I like about podcasts or like conversations like this, although as you said, it's not a podcast, is that we can meander, right? We can go wherever is interesting. You can get into the weeds of the interesting bits and then skim over the less interesting bits. And yeah, just the ability to follow threads that come up in the moment that might not otherwise come up, I think is great. Like I I really enjoy audio for that reason. And of course for people who are listening in, it feels more personal. Yeah, so yeah, I enjoy them all these things for in their own way, as it were.
So you mentioned that you've had some interesting and thought-provoking discussions on social media, and that's also inspired you. Anything come to mind where it inspired you to write a new piece or rethink your prior take on a topic?
Um, I don't know about like immediately. This is one I should have thought about in advance. I think it's yeah, sometimes I mean I'll definitely see what often happens is I will see someone interpreting something that I've done in a different way to how I interpreted the data, or how I even interpreted the whole topic. And that will lead me to think, yeah, maybe that's not a perspective I'd considered, or maybe that sparks an entire different way of looking at that topic and like coming back at it in a different angle. So I think those can be really helpful. Or it's often just a place where, for me, the gold dust in terms of ideas is seeing like a half-formed thought that I can then fully form, as it were. So whether I'm on social or listening to podcasts or reading stuff, it's those things where someone says something in passing and I think, now that's very interesting. I wonder what the data says on that. So that for me, I'd say would be like a classic way that a bunch of my ideas begin. But yeah, I think just, I guess, right. So to your question about whether there are often replies to things I post that spark new ideas, I think the sweet spot for that is when I'm not so much when I've just posted a big piece, because usually, although there will be interesting things that come off the back of that, I will need to be thinking, right, if I'm going to come at this topic again, I need to come at it from a completely different perspective and like move things on and do it in a few months. Whereas when I just post more of my own half-formed thoughts and responses to things, that's where the response to those I can then think, right, here's something I could flesh out. Um, all of which I think again is this roundabout way of saying it's, I still haven't figured out, having been on these platforms for like 10 years, whether it's a good use of my time or bad use of my time. I think the answer is both, depending on how much and when and how. But yeah.
Cool. So we have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to open it up for audience questions, discussion, thoughts this has sparked for all of you. And feel free to raise your hand, post comments in the chat, ask questions. Um, Everything is good. Um, I have another question for you, John. So you're on Twitter a lot, you have a lot of these charts, and they're very easy to weaponize or manipulate, decontextualize. Um, have you noticed that becoming an increasing problem? And does that change how you use these charts or how you design them?
It's really interesting. So I haven't seen like the weaponization per se. Or I mean, I guess having said that, like on the progressive, why progressives should care about falling birth rates piece, as you and I were discussing this earlier, like I tried to frame that in a way that would again not be provocative to anyone, but certainly there are a lot of conservatives who quite enjoy just sort of putting that out there and saying, see, like progressives are going extinct and that kind of thing. So the thing I just do there is I make sure that the actual words on the chart are not part of that. Like if other people want to use my charts to make points that I didn't intend, A, there's just no way around that. Like I have no control over that. B, I generally think if I've um surfaced something interesting, then the more people who see that interesting thing, the better, regardless of what the commentary is over the top of it. Um, but yeah, I think it's just a sort of live by the sword, die by the sword situation on that front. There was like once upon a time during the COVID stuff that we were doing, there was in the early days when our charts started getting a lot of pickup, we sort of thought, this, people are using our stuff to get their own engagement or whatever. And there were some cases where people would crop off the Financial Times source at the bottom of a chart. But I think usually that was unintentional, the cropping. And B, we're in this special position where because all of our charts have that pinkish, beigeish background, they're immediately recognizable anyway. So people can crop all they want, but it's still free branding. So yeah, generally, I think if my stuff is getting out there, then as whatever's being said is fair enough. If someone is, completely twisting and almost misdescribing a chart, then that frustrates me a little bit. But again, at the end of the day, that's information, just is information.
Yeah. Inez, you had a question.
Oh, yes. So is there data to show a per capita or cohort decrease in social media use? That's referring to your answer to my previous question.
So I did something a month or so ago showing that there's seems to be a suggestion that just in the last couple of years, there's maybe been a slight decrease in social media use. That's led by younger people in some like European countries, but seems to still be rising in the US maybe. But so that data was from a company that has been doing surveys of people 4 times a year for about 10 years, I think it was. And what I like about that approach, right, there's a trade-off, right? So a survey is not direct measurement. This isn't data from like Apple, for
Yeah.
example, saying screen time. That would be the gold standard. But I do like at least that this is a company that has been doing this for like 10 years. It's not someone who's just done like one survey 2 years ago and one today and said numbers have come down. So yeah, that data I think is interesting. And so I wrote a piece saying that or essentially asking like or theorizing that maybe we're looking at a turning point in social media use. But there was still the question of even if we are, what are people spending that time on instead? I don't think it's necessarily being off their phones. It might, as I say, have been LLMs or something else. But yeah, so that's the best data I've seen on that. That's an idea I've been thinking about for like a year or so. Because as you know, it's a classic example of what I talk about with a hunch. So as more and more people have complained about how social media feels worse, and more of the conversation about TikTok and brain rot and that kind of thing, I just started to wonder, well, maybe we're going to see among the younger generation who are often the first to move, maybe we will see that line turn. And so I just did loads of Googling around to try and find if there was any data on this. So I found a couple of charts from these sort of marketing firms' reports, and then I figured out where the source was, got in touch with them. And yeah, it turned out they were actually like super helpful. They had a whole data team who were able to get the data going back 10 years. So yeah, I would say because that's only one source and it's a survey, we can't definitively say that we've passed peak social media, but I do think there are signs that suggest we might be around that point. And again, with the rise of generative I think it's plausible that we would see people switching from one to the other, and that would mean a decline, and for me, a good thing.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
It would be interesting to see how social media use compares to phone use. And then as LLMs become more ubiquitous, it gets woven into social media. I think we've all heard about Meta using AI chatbots and so on. So I'd be curious if there's like a dip and then people come back again, or if they're just like fed up with social media in all of its forms and are using their phones in other ways or
Yeah,
going up.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's even the question of how do we define social media now, right? Like, again, it feels like one possibility is people might start spending less time on TikTok, but more on WhatsApp and that kind of thing. And then, yeah, there's like separate, we could fast forward 5 years, and does everyone have an earpiece where they just chat to their AI? And in that case, is no one on their screens at all? Or, yeah, who knows?
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
No, nothing more from me.
Cool. So John, what are you working on next? Where can we keep up with your work? Is it all in the Financial Times? Are you sharing more work on Twitter? I'm curious. Are you starting a podcast?
Sort of almost all the above. No, so yeah, I'll have this piece about taxes coming this Friday. And we're also, my colleague Sarah O'Connor and I are now doing this weekly newsletter about the impact of AI on the labour market. That goes out every Thursday. And then yeah, I pop up from time to time on other things. Like occasionally I do FT podcasts or bits and pieces for other people. And I'm just trying to think, what else am I looking at the moment? Oh yeah, other ideas that I find interesting at the moment. One is like the rise of young people getting special accommodations in exams and that kind of thing. Because anecdotally, again, hunch territory, that's something I hear in the UK. I'm hearing it in the US, and so interested in what's happening with that. So I might write about that soon. And then a perpetual hot topic of is everything really going to shit for young people? But through like economics and finance lens. So this is something I've written about in the past, but it seems to just constantly come back up, especially in the US. And so, yeah, it's something I'm looking at again to see if you look at things using different measures, different data, what is the evidence-based story we could tell for why things feel so bad versus what are the evidence-based stories that don't seem to support that. So yeah, all soon to be coming to to a pink background and a social platform near you. Oh yeah, that's the other thing I should have said. We do all of our stuff in as like Instagram Reels and stuff as well now,
Oh,
and on
I didn't know
TikTok.
that.
We're taking the approach of if these platforms are full of brain rot, then let's try to fight that by putting some less brain rotty stuff on there.
Cool. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah,
I still love long form and podcasts, so those are
absolutely.
typically
That's the
my
thing. You kind of just got to be everywhere these days, and I actually quite like it. Like it feels like the 90-second real version of my columns is good because I know that's going to reach certain people who would not be reading the Financial Times. But then the podcast version is good because I know that's reaching different people who have different thoughts. And yeah, it's good to feel like I'm not leaving anyone out, as it were.
yeah. Matt, you had a question?
Yeah, just a really quick one. I noticed that your colleagues at Alphaville have started a Substack in the past week. I was
Yeah.
wondering if you've thought of doing the same for the data side of things.
So the short version of that is that I'm not allowed. So the reason Alphaville have so for those who don't know, Alphaville is like the bloggy finance bit of the FT, which is very, very online, as it were. So that section has actually always been free for anyone to read. And so from the business perspective, putting that on Substack is like win-win. It just gets us to a new audience without losing any audience. Whereas the general policy at the FT is that we're not meant to have Substacks because it would be in theory sort of giving people stuff for free or even worse from their perspective for my benefit, as it were, instead of people reading the FT. So I mean, just speaking personally, I quite like the Economist's approach here, where they let their journalists have Substacks where they do the sort of behind the scenes on things that didn't make it into the final cut, or they can talk about interesting things they're reading elsewhere. I think that's a sensible approach for a lot of like high-end news organizations to allow people to sort of show behind the scenes, build up an audience, and then in theory you'd convert some of the Substack audience into the subscribers. But yeah, so at the moment the FT's policy is we're dipping our toes in via Alphaville because that's always been free. And may well be that the overall policy will change, but for now it's yeah, I stick my stuff on ft.com and no one tells me off if I put it on social media. But actually, sorry, just to finish that point, that there was a point again during like the COVID days when it was a live question of whether me doing threads on social media was cannibalizing the FT's audience. But it turned out a lot of people emailed the FT, emailed the editor saying that they'd subscribed to the FT because of the stuff I was putting out for free on social media. So yeah, I guess it was social media has ended up being more like marketing rather than competition. So yeah.
Yeah,
But honestly, it's so interesting being in this space in 2025 because 15 years ago, if you wrote for a newspaper, you wrote for a newspaper, that was it. But now everything's evolving so quickly and everyone's constantly trying to work out what is the optimal strategy for getting as many people to be aware of ours, and then how do you convert people to paying subscribers and all of that. So yeah, fun times.
yeah, I mean, for all of social media's ills, it's still how I find interesting things to read and subscribe to and interesting people to
Yeah,
talk to. So there is that.
yeah.
Well, John, thank you so much for spending your evening with us. This was a really interesting conversation. I had so much fun, and I'm also really grateful to everyone who joined and asked great questions. I'm looking forward to your pieces coming out and your podcasts. And thank you again for joining. Good night, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. And yeah, great to chat to everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
So, thanks.